Okay, I think we're going to get started. So, hello everyone again. It's a privilege to be a moderator on this final panel of the day first of the conference. As you know from the program, this panel will be focusing on the path for strategic connectivity in the Greater Black Sea region, and I hope that we will have the opportunity to see what are the opportunities for cooperation in the wider Black Sea region, because part of our conference today was focusing more on the conflict and competition among different actors in the region involved, whether regional or global. But I believe that this part, of course, we cannot avoid talking about the conflicts in the region, but also it will be focused on what are the avenues for fostering the cooperation. Let me introduce our wonderful speakers. Niva, the fellow at Foreign Policy Research Institute. Tinatin Khidasheli, head of Civic Idea. Ambassador Vasil Sikharulidze, senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And Zenel Garcia, associate professor of security studies at the Department of National Security and Strategy, U.S. Army War College. So we can start, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for a very kind invitation, Meyer. I've worked for FPRI for a couple of years now, and in parallel to that, I also worked for the OSCE, which I left earlier this year, where I worked on commissioned research on China and Central Asia and Afghanistan. I've also recently joined the Atlantic Council in DC, where I'm picking up kind of new subjects. And so a little bit of my background before I get started, just because I think context really matters who you're listening from. I'm originally from Hong Kong, and so when I'm here this whole morning, every single panel, people are bringing up the topic of China, which I think is very interesting, because no matter what we're talking about today, there's always a China angle, literally politics or economy or even entertainment, right? Social media, TikTok, all that. So being the only Chinese person in the room, I really want to, be your resource on like what's going on in domestic China, but also, in the context of this panel, give you a little bit of background on like what is China's interest and like how they've been implementing activities to actually achieve those interests in Central Asia and beyond. So speaking of interest, I think for Central Asia, which we don't really have a map on here anymore, but earlier we know where Central Asia is, right? It borders a region that China calls Xinjiang, which is East Turkestan / Uyghur region. And so one of the first, the biggest and the most foundational Chinese interests in Central Asia is precisely on Xinjiang. And so that was the starting point of the relations in the 90s, right? Because China did not expect the region to actually become independent. So in the 90s, China was genuinely worried that Xinjiang could become independent, because when Kazakhstan is independent, Kyrgyzstan is independent, Tajikistan is independent, why not the Uyghurs also establish the East Turkestan? So back in the 90s, this was very serious possibility for Beijing, particularly at a time when they didn't have a full grasp of the region in terms of the leaders, the people. So they had nothing, right? So in the 90s, what happened was China pursued Central Asian leaders in an extremely aggressive manner and quickly signed all the border treaties. And that was done together with Russia, right? Under what was then the Shanghai Five, which became Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And so what happened was actually a lot of the deals, Russia also helped China in establishing with Central Asian states, because every single one of those border treaty meetings had heads of Russian representatives on it. And what happened at the time was China was led by a man called Jiang Zemin, who was educated in the Soviet Union. He spoke Russian. And the Jiang Zemin administration was, largely also headed by Russian language educated Chinese officials that looked up to the Soviet Union. So at the time, Jiang Zemin actually gave a lot of parts of the far east of Russia, which were claimed by the Qing dynasty, back to Russia. So within China, domestically, a lot of people still call Jiang Zemin like a traitor for giving away Chinese territories, including a lot of parts of the Kazakh territory and the Kyrgyz territory. So that was the context. These border treaties nonetheless helped China legitimize their own rule over Xinjiang, which was contested in the 90s, right? Because there were a lot of groups that were claiming independence. And so part of controlling the territory on Xinjiang, working with Central Asian states, is this idea of controlling the narrative of what's going on in Xinjiang. So in the 2000s and 2010s, we start to see this narrative of like the three evils, right? Separatism, extremism, and terrorism. But what was actually going on in Xinjiang, and to a large extent still going on today, is actually a political movement against discriminative policies against ethnic minorities, right? This has always been a political movement of ethnic minorities in Xinjiang who are fighting for representation and voice within the Chinese government. It was never terrorism, right? At least not originally the way that it was. So the narrative that Central Asia has over what's going on in Xinjiang is precisely the three evils. It's terrorism. We have no sympathies towards the ethnic Uyghurs across the border because they don't see it as a political movement. There is no recognition of what's going on in Xinjiang as colonialism on the part of the Han Chinese. The same way that a lot of Central Asians do not see their experience with the Russians as colonialism. So the narrative control was something that the Chinese really pursued in the region early on. And also practical measures as well, all the law enforcement cooperation and also extradition treaties and kidnappings of certain diaspora leaders from the Uyghur community was done also in the 90s. There were literally murders on the streets in Bishkek of those heads of Uyghur organizations. So all of this, is still the foundation of Chinese interest in Central Asia, as we see in the latest summit as well. Much of the discussion still on it is backing, the security, it's creating this like security guarantee that Central Asia will back China on everything Xinjiang related. Second, and I think second is where I think it relates to the Black Sea region and our Russia, Eurasia hands in audience is China is interested in Central Asia because it wants to create and build a land-based trade route. And what is that? So that predates the Belt and Road Initiative. Because already in the 90s, when the Chinese officials, like the largest delegation that first went to Central Asia, it was led by Li Peng, the former premier. It was in 1994. And already back then, he was in Central Asia talking about reviving the old Silk Road. So that was before the Belt and Road Initiative. And the whole idea back in the day was Chinese scholars and a lot of policymakers believed that the Chinese civilization was the strongest back in the day when global trade was a land-based trade route, when it wasn't dependent on the sea. So there's a lot of symbolism towards like going back to this, glory days of the Chinese civilization and rebuilding this land-based trade route. It sounds very bizarre, but this is how a lot of the Chinese strategists actually think about the future of China, particularly at a time right now when the legitimacy of the regime is no longer backed by economic growth, but is backed by nationalist sentiments. So a lot of these symbolic things that back foreign policies actually make a lot of sense. And so what is this land-based trade route and how is China building it in Central Asia? There's the China-Kazakhstan oil pipeline that was very quickly constructed in the 2000s. There's also the China-Central Asia gas pipeline, which goes from Turkmenistan, which the previous panel already talked a lot about. But just the context of why these two pipelines are incredibly important because they helped reorientate the region from Russia to China, right? Having China as the alternative buyer of all these resources. And these resources are important to China too. So if we just look at gas, about 50% of Chinese consumption of gas is imported from overseas. And amongst that, 40% comes from Turkmenistan. So the Central Asian China gas pipeline is actually incredibly important for the Chinese economy. But then, of course, we have to keep in mind today the Chinese economy is declining. If you looked at the FDI figures, that China received in past years plummeted so badly, compared to even pandemic data. And unemployment rate in China, so on and so forth. All the tension is the Chinese economy is not doing great. So to what extent is that going to have a significance on Black Sea and Central Asia? I think we can draw a lot from that. Just a little bit of context of trade figures because, building this land-based trade route, meaning that, China actually is trading with Central Asian states, right? So in 1991, the regional trade bilateral trade with China was $463 million. And then in 2013, it became $50 billion. And last year, it was $70 billion. But a lot of it is still concentrated in energy. So that's oil and gas and other minerals. And much of this regional trade with China is based off of this railway, right? The China-Europe express train that goes from, before the Ukraine war, it went from China, Russia, or Kazakhstan, and then into Belarus, further on into Europe. Right now, it's China, Kazakhstan, Caspian Sea, the middle corridor bit to Europe. Now, I have a lot I want to say about the railway, but some of the most bizarre stories I cannot talk about it on the record, but if you're interested, please ask me privately. But basically, China built this entire railway as a form of control. This is a political asset. And I think a couple of years ago, we finally see how China used that when Lithuania opened the Taiwan office and they just stopped exporting anything to Lithuania via the railway. I think we don't have to make guesses anymore. The fact that China builds these infrastructure across the world is to be used at a time when it needs to use it as a form of punishment against certain behaviors that it doesn't want. So what does that mean? For China, business operation is backed by political goals. It's not pure business. China is able to use its own money to pursue a lot of things, and that's not just corrupting political leaders, but it's also supporting political leaders, giving away technology that will actually help them strengthen their own regime. And this is a transactional relationship that Central Asian leaders are fully aware of. They understand what they are giving to China, which is legitimizing China's rule over Xinjiang, and what they're gaining back in return, which is helping them secure their own regime, helping them extract certain money and profits from investments and projects with China, and they are happy with that, and we can see that. I think there was a window of opportunity maybe a couple of years ago when Central Asian countries could have been more open to Western engagement. But now they have fully decided, especially since last month, the Xi'an summit, now they've fully decided that the path with China is the path to go. Because for the first time, we see from bilateral communiques this line where it says no matter what direction China will take, Central Asia will be with China in this common destiny. And this is something that we didn't see before. So what it means is no matter what way China decides to go, and what we think of is Taiwan. Right. So if China were to really go down this path of invading Taiwan, then Central Asia will be with China. This has been the message that is new in the past month, and I think that's been very clear. And the last thing that we can draw from is the idea that traditionally China has all these red lines, right, on Hong Kong, on Xinjiang, on Taiwan, and on Tibet. But the red lines are actually expanding because we also see that there are a lot of things that China demands from Central Asia that is beyond these red lines. And one of them is something that I think could actually be a problem in the Black Sea region, and that is having local governments address the issue of anti-Chinese sentiment. So the Chinese embassies around the region actually will go to whoever leaders that that they can have FaceTime with, and they will say, well, if you want investments, we worry about the treatment of our nationals in your country. And so all these polls that are coming out on, what is the perception of, Georgians on Chinese, and if the figures are bad, that actually is a statistic for the Chinese embassy to come to you and be like, hey, if you don't fix this, investments are not going to come. And this is a new red line. And I think that's dangerous because China is able to push a lot of these conventional red lines according to the objectives that they have or they could have tomorrow. And I think that makes, China... China should be a very unappealing partner for democracies, authoritarian countries, precisely because China is not predictable. And I'll stop here. I'll love to have more time for Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's continue with Mr. David.
Yes. Thank you, Giorgi. I know that being a speaker of the last panel is terrible. Everybody hates you. I'll try to be brief. Let me start by reading a line from a secret document of CIA. Yeah.
Is it true, agent?
The 3,500-mile gas pipeline from Siberia to Germany is a direct threat to the future of Western Europe. It said that creating serious repercussions from a dangerous reliance on the Russian fuel. This is truly from a CIA secret document, but it's 41 years old. The CIA was advising President Ronald Reagan to do something about the building pipeline. I think it's a current pipeline. And in 1981, President Reagan introduced sanctions on the technologies that were required to build for this pipeline for national security purposes. However, after the heavy pressure from European friends and his own gas lobby, he lifted the sanctions, and then we got this pipeline, and this prediction of CIA analysts became true. So it played devastating role for European security, for any others. So I think that while speaking about the strategic connectivity, we should be, of course, taking into consideration all these amounts, the gas or oil or whatever is transported, and then prices, but also the strategic considerations are the most important. So yet another case that also shows very well that what are the practical implications of this kind of problem is that the case from the Georgia's history 2006. So when the Georgian energy sector, especially the gas, was entirely 100% dependent on the gas that we were receiving from Russia. Technically, when we were going to our kitchen and putting the gas on, it was Turkmen gas that we were getting in our kitchen. And the Georgia in 2006 was paying $480 per 1,000 cubic meter, the same price that Germany was paying for the gas. But guess how much was Turkmens were getting out of it? $50 only. The rest was pocketing by Russia. And even with, the Turkmen government was even very grateful to Russia because of this, even of this $50, because it was the only way for Turkmens to sell their gas to outside the world. And the Turkmen economy was pretty much dependent on these gas sales. So it's a small example, but it shows how important this the strategic connectivity is, and the alternatives to energy and also some other connectivity are. So I think that the importance of Trans-Caspian and Trans-Caucasian projects became, I was hearing about this importance of Trans-Caspian and Trans-Caucasian projects entire my career. Batu, we were on the coffee break, and Batu reminded me the first legislation initiated by the Senator Brownback back in 1999. The name was that New Silk Road Strategic Act or something, right? That was speaking about the importance of the opening this corridor for to connect Central Asia with the European market, bypassing Russia. However, not much has been done in this regard, and not primarily because of the economic considerations, but primarily because of political considerations. Our Western colleagues, we are not forceful enough to support fully the Trans-Caspian, Trans-Caucasian projects, and our Central Asian colleagues, we are also not really very willing to confront Russia in this situation and then promote this. But how important this Trans-Caspian, Trans-Caucasian projects are, the first has been proved by Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan project that brought Azerbaijani oil to the Western markets, and then Baku-Tbilisi-Erzurum gas pipeline project that delivered the gas from Western Caspia to the European markets. So that means that and that gave Georgia energy independence, and we were for years less dependent on Russian gas than, for example, Germany or any other European country. So that means that this Trans-Caucasian, Trans-Caspian projects has huge potential. As we speak, and after this invasion of Ukraine in 2022, I think that it has become obvious, not only for analysts, but also for politicians, how important are these projects and how they should be doing much more with it to make that happen. So practically every week, if not practically every month, if not every week, we can see new deals signed. Only last week we had two major deals signed that considers the strategic connectivity through Trans-Caspian and Trans-Caucasian routes. First is that Kazakhs signed agreement with Azerbaijan that will bring Kazakh oil through Tbilisi-Baku-Ceyhan pipeline to the Western markets. The second was that our good friends Adenauer Foundation reminded us a couple of days ago that the Germany signed a contract with Kazakhstan to develop and bring green hydrogen from Kazakhstan to Western markets. And all this only makes sense if there is the developed way of Trans-Caucasian and Trans-Caspian network. So in this regard, when we are speaking about the strategic connectivity, I think that it has to be considered as a holistic approach should be considered. So there are certain issues that we have to be focusing, and security is one of them. The Georgia has a unique role in this development, and because the Georgia was considered for years. It's not the case now, unfortunately, but we will come back to it. But Georgia for years was considered as a leader in its democratic reforms, and therefore it was considered as a window toward West for Central Asia, our Central Asian partners, and therefore all this strategic connectivity ideas were related to one way or another with Georgia. So I think that in this regard, it was very important, this 2008 commitment that the Georgia will eventually become NATO member, that was considered by our neighbors as a more security and stability into the region. Our region is really very unique in terms of this. We have the three small countries in the region, and all of them had one or the other way different approaches to their future security. So Azerbaijan was more neutral with the special relations with Turkey, and Armenia was aligning himself militarily with Russia. However, none of them considered Georgia's eventual NATO membership as a threat, even quite on contrary. So all of them considered Georgia's eventual NATO membership as an additional factor for security and stability for the region. So I think that while promoting strategic connectivity, which includes not only energy but also the transportation, connectivity with regard of data, because the Central Asian countries are also heavily dependent on Russia with their data cables and then data exchange, digital connections. Also, we see different projects related to the green hydrogen or electricity. I think that we have to be more focusing on the political aspects of it, security and democracy of the democratic development of Georgia would be very important factor in strengthening this. Strengthening the strategic connectivity issue. So I will stop here, so not to go further in details, and I'll be ready to continue it in a conversational way during the question and answer session.
Okay, thank you, David, for bringing the emphasis on the importance of having this holistic approach to this issue of the strategic connectivity. Now, I would like to give floor to Tinatin, Khidasheli, please.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on this very interesting forum. Dato stole my opening phrase about being on the last panel, and I'll try to be not to be very boring and not let you to sleep during this panel. Basically, what I wanted to talk about is kind of continuing what Niva started and articulating Georgia, importance of Georgia, and in this whole dynamics of strategic connectivity, as it was mentioned several times by David. Here in this country, we constantly talk about Russia, and there is an obvious reason for it, and obviously it's no surprise for anybody. With the occupation in Georgia itself, and with all the disturbing roles in so many different ways Russia plays in the region, obviously it is on our mind all the time and constantly. But in this Russia-dominated foreign policy or Russia-dominated strategic thinking in Georgia. For many years, we missed other important dimensions, other important players who are already, and in the future even more, will be affecting the faith of this whole strategic connectivity or energy diversity or Georgia's place in the world and in various strategic projects important for both West and East. And that is obviously our other neighbors, being it Iran or Turkey, but more importantly it's China. China that was and still is not, unfortunately, topic of serious discussion in this country. China that not that many people are looking at, watching, monitoring. There is not that big interest, and there is an understanding still that it's too far away, and the idea Georgians have developed over the years that if it's not your immediate neighbor, then there is no threat from it, is kind of alive here. And that probably is one of the biggest mistakes we are all making in this country, and also I would say, in the entire South Caucasus. Different from Georgia, if we go to Armenia, it's even worse. In Armenia, I would say that it's not even 1% of that very small portion of thinking about China in Georgia. In Armenia, you don't have even 1% of that in Armenia. In Armenia, the understanding of China is really of something very distant, completely unrelated, and having nothing to do with their foreign policy or domestic affairs or any strategic ideas and projects they are already involved or planning to be involved in. But the truth of the matter is that as soon as, and Niva mentioned 94, for example, is kind of a starting point. Obviously, there were, because of the common border with China, and closeness of the Soviet Union and China. Central Asian republics were more historically much beyond 94 involved in various ways with China, but starting from that moment when first Chinese investment or first Chinese state-to-state contract entered any of the Central Asian republics, it kind of started writing a blueprint for the entire wide region of Central Asia and South Caucasus. And as we speak now, I can tell you with full confidence that if you study well enough and close enough, say Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, Chinese relationships, you basically know what comes next here in Georgia or what's going to happen tomorrow in Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's the same book of the rules, same game that Chinese are playing in all these countries. For them, there is no particular interest in Georgia or in any of the countries of the South Caucasus. It is important as much as it's part of this, exactly of the strategic connectivity of a wider region of the Caspian energy resources and being on a transit route for their trade ambitions and trade goals in today's world. This is exactly why, even on the level of the companies involved in these countries, the businesses who enter these countries, you have all the time the same names. Nothing changes. It's the same company building roads in Kyrgyzstan and in Georgia, bribing officials in Kyrgyzstan and in Georgia. The only difference is that Kyrgyz Prime Minister is in prison for that. Georgia is not yet. So that's kind of how close and so how similar are those links and attitudes to the region. And we also see this difference of the strategic narratives that Chinese are constantly controlling, obviously, and it's been the case forever. And but particularly after the war in Ukraine, but I would say even 3-4 years before that, we see the change in those narratives that were well known and kind of accepted for granted in our countries. For example, even now people will tell you that China does not have enemies. In their propaganda, they never talk about other countries. It's just about creating positive image of China and the countries where they want to enter, and that's it. This is where the propaganda machinery ends. That's what it's all about. Or another very developed and very well developed and very famous narrative that you hear in these parts of the world, maybe in other parts of the world as well, but I don't know how it works in Latin America, for example. But here, definitely, it's that China does not have any military or close to military strategic ambitions in the region. It's all about economy, it's only about the business, and that's it. And even more, I've heard in Kazakhstan, for example, people still telling me that China and Russia have divided this world in terms of the interests. Russia is here militarily, and China is here economically, and that's kind of a deal they cut after the breakup of the Soviet Union. It could have been true to such a level years back, but now there is an absolutely different attitude and different narratives that we see. First of all, of course, China has an enemy, at least in these parts of the world. It's called the United States, and it is absolutely clear, and there is no it's no secret that every single strategic narrative that you are getting from Chinese as to what kind of messages there should be out in the media or what is it there people affiliated with them in one way or another should be talking about, it always involves United States. It's not just about positive of China anymore, but it is very much about those who are disturbing that positive image of China. And obviously, US is on top of this list. In terms of the interests, obviously, again, we see, starting from the fact that there is actual military base in Tajikistan, I mean Chinese military base in Tajikistan, and going throughout the region, even in Ukraine and Georgia, right before the war, there were series of contracts with the militaries, with the ministries of defense and military industry in these countries, by the Chinese both government and the private sector, if we can talk about private sector in China, but whatever it is, at least that's how they frame it. And as well as with Russia. Obviously, we all know that right before the start of the war, at the end of 21, there was this full-scale military cooperation agreement signed between Russia and China, by which they are actually involved in all those military drills in Russia and all kinds of training activities with the Russian soldiers throughout this last 2 or 3 years now. The list is long. We can go from one topic to another and see this change of strategies, or even I would say more tactics rather than strategies when it comes to this region and to different countries in this region. But at least the idea of this neutral, only economically involved China is long gone, and we see so many other ways of interaction with the countries all over the world, and in this case, as my research interests are related to the region, I can more freely talk about the region, obviously. Just to say a couple of words about Georgia in this direction, we've just finished in my organization the media monitoring report of the Georgian media. I mean, from the perspective of the Chinese soft power influence operations in Georgian media. And it does not even cover 2023 because the dynamic of change is very rapid. You have like every month it is changing and it's getting worse and worse. So up until December 2022, what the report shows is that there is a very clear strategic narrative developed by the Georgian government and used by the media, controlled by the Georgian government, in so many different ways we cannot even imagine. It's not just when they directly talk about China. For example, public broadcaster had this program called Chinese Diaries, which was about China. It was 1 hour every week, exclusively about China. And obviously there you had everything from Uyghur issues to prosperous, developing Chinese technologies all over the world, being dominating the world and everything. So that was very clear. That's even was very predictable as well, because this is a special program devoted to China, basically telling the Georgian public what a miracle is happening in that country every day in also all directions of life, from military to education and academia and business and everything. But that's not what we are worried about, because usually those kinds of programs are not that much influencing public, because when you start watching it, you already know it's pure propaganda, and somehow you are not influenced by that. If you know beforehand that someone sits there for this particular reason to bullshit, basically, then it's okay. I mean, you are not under influence. But what we see on all three main TV channels run by the ruling party, it's having this kind of a guideline that every time they need to bring a positive example that something works very well, differently, and does not necessarily require democracy. There is China example always. Always. I mean, you cannot make a mistake. Every time they need to show you, to prove, to give an example that, well, no problem, it works even without democracy, they will give you a straightforward, facts-based example from China. And this whole idea of one-party rule, no necessary democratic regulations, no market economy, no, as we know it obviously, no free media, no freedom of speech at the universities. It actually works and brings society to development, to welfare, to security. Here is always an example from China. And obviously, Chinese are playing a big role in that because I believe it's the case for all the countries represented here, but with all these well-developed study tours to China that takes journalists, NGO activists, professors, I mean, you name it, anybody, to China. We call it to the 7+ star trips where they show the miracles happening on this earth today in front of our eyes. Obviously helps a lot in believing the picture that Chinese Communist Party is trying to give to all of us. And it's just one example of how this whole system works and how much they care about a country as small as Georgia is. Or even we can say, it hurts my feelings, but as unimportant as Georgia is, right? And from there, obviously you still need to do research, you still need to look into data, but you can already get an idea how much time, money, energy they spend in countries as big, as important as Uzbekistan is or as Kazakhstan is, and how big is the influence and soft power influence and propaganda machinery in those countries where their actual economic, business, strategic interests lie. So now, the last point I want to make is what has changed after Russia's brutal invasion to Ukraine. From this point of view, obviously, there are lots of dimensions to it, but from the point of view of the issues that we are talking in this panel. One of the very significant things that we are constantly monitoring, and the people who are watching China, my advice will be to look carefully, is shifting attitudes and loyalties in Central Asia. Niva was talking about this news from the last month that all the Central Asian leaders are constantly talking about aligning with China, standing with China, supporting China in all the difficulties and all the controversies they might face. And Taiwan obviously is always on our mind when we hear those statements. But actually it did not start last month. It started last fall when Xi Jinping decided to do his first after COVID visit exactly in Central Asia. And he went first to Uzbekistan, then first to Kazakhstan and then to Uzbekistan, and made very interesting statements addressing all the fears those countries had after the invasion to Ukraine, particularly Kazakhstan being so much influenced by Russians, having huge Russian minority, Russian-speaking population in their country, and plus to that, majority of those people living actually on the border with Russia, and this whole fear of losing or being next. If in Georgia we were absolutely sure that if things go wrong in Ukraine, then Georgia is next. I can tell you with full confidence that the feelings were exactly the same in Kazakhstan. In Kazakhstan, people actually believed that Kazakhstan was going to be next after Ukraine on Putin's plan. And when Xi Jinping arrived to Kazakhstan, he made it clear for everybody, and he made sure that everybody understood him and got the message that when he said at the press conference standing with Tokayev that China was there for them, that China, and he used exactly this language, he used this word, at least in translation. I don't know how they sounded in Chinese, but I heard them in English, and he said that against anybody and by all means, to support and to stand with Kazakhstan, he used those two sentences, against anybody and by all means, which was kind of very clear message for Kazakhs that, wow, we've got a new big brother out there who is ready to help us, support us, stand with us. And then he went to Tashkent from Astana and repeated exactly the same, almost the same words, and not exactly, but almost the same, used almost the same language and repeated the message. And it was after that moment that you can see in the public statements, at least, made by the leadership, particularly in those countries, not that much in Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan, and we don't hear anything from Turkmenistan. That's also true. Sometimes I think that this country even does not exist. It's kind of an imaginary land invented by Lenin or Stalin or somebody at one point for sharing the wealth from Caspian Sea. But the leadership of these two countries definitely, starting with the members of parliament, going to ministers and the presidents themselves, constantly constantly trying to distance themselves as much as obviously as possible from Russia and align themselves with China whenever it comes to the issues of controversy, Ukraine, Crimea, and all those issues. This kind of elite capture that we are witnessing in these parts of the world, which is true for my country, unfortunately, as well, from Chinese leadership, is obviously for a reason. That somebody on the previous panel said that there are no small and big countries for China, and that's exactly the point, that they are trying to be a nice friend and partner with everybody, exactly for the purposes of China troops, the trade ambitions they have, but also for controlling the foreign policy decisions those countries are making. And the influence on taking positions, aligning with Chinese positions at the international level is huge. And if you look at the Central Asian countries who completely shifted from Russia-driven policies towards China-driven policies, both at the UN level and other international institutions, you can clearly see that difference. With Georgia, it's not the case yet. Georgia still goes with, at least on voting, with the Western democracies. But I know for a fact that that kind of request and that kind of influence is already here on the Georgian government as well, to align themselves with the Chinese vote, which is neutral. And they don't vote against Ukraine, obviously, which is neutral at all international forums. We need to see how much Georgian government can resist, but unfortunately it's already here and it's already the case. So I will stop here, and yes, looking forward for questions and comments and discussion.
Thank you very much for this insightful talk, and I agree totally that we somehow, at least from the Georgian perspective, we need to broaden our kind of strategic vision, which is really Russia-centered at the moment, and we should bring into discussion the long-term negative impact which China's so-called benign economy-focused or low-profile focused politics might have in the long-term perspective. Thank you very much. So I will give now floor to the Zenel.
Thank you all for still hanging around here at this time of the day. Thanks again for FPRI's invitation for me to participate in this conference and for Ilia State University for hosting us. Standard disclaimer, since I work at the Army War College, my arguments are my own, not representative of the Army War College, DoD, the United States government. Now that's out of the way. I think a lot of what my comments are going to be based around is going to build off of what Niva discussed earlier. And I think that what I really want to get across today is probably fill in a gap that I find very prominent in policy circles, especially within DC, but you find it a lot, pretty much no matter what country you go to. And that is that a perspective of the BRI is purely a geopolitical construct, and that it is a very coherent policy. When in practice, what is usually missing in the studies of the BRI is, one, its inherently fragmented nature. One, that its geopolitical effects, which are real, were initially incidental and not the primary driving force for the BRI. And that is not to say that the Xi Jinping and people on the Senate committee don't have geopolitical aims with the BRI. But what I'm going to lay out here is that the fragmented nature of the BRI makes a coherent geopolitical variant of the BRI incredibly difficult to actually implement. And that might actually be interesting or helpful for people that are, studying China and have legitimate concerns or interests related to China, to try to unpack as you think about what are the right responses to the challenges that China presents, as well as whatever opportunities that China might present. And so what I'll start off with is, I'll cover three basic things. One, the domestic origins and drivers of the Belt and Road Initiative. So really, why is it that it is primarily a domestically driven policy as opposed to one that is purely foreign policy and geopolitical? Second, the central, and I mean central government, and locally fragmented nature of the Belt and Road Initiative. And lastly, I'll conclude what are the implications of that, especially for the Black Sea region. Now, to put a note, it's not just my research that comes to this conclusion. Pretty much anybody that studies domestic Chinese politics and looks at its effects on foreign policy, people far better and more capable than I am, pretty much have a consensus on this very fragmented nature of the Belt and Road. So domestic origins and drivers of the Belt and Road, I think Niva pointed out very early on, right, that the origins of the Belt and Road don't really begin with Xi Jinping. And in practice, you could look at every single one of the major corridors outlined by the Belt and Road vision document, at least the first iteration in 2015, which is then updated a couple of years later. Every single one of those corridors originate in late 80s, early 90s provincial level policies to integrate those policies simultaneously both to the greater Chinese economy, but also to their immediate neighbors. So if you look at, for example, even a province like Xinjiang, right? The China Central Asia, West Asia Economic Corridor, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the New Eurasian land bridge, all three of those pretty much originate as Xinjiang level provincial policies in the 1990s, which were then integrated into more national, regional level policies like the Great Western Development Strategy or the Go West strategy during the early 2000s. So by the time you get to Xi Jinping, you've actually already set up a lot of the infrastructure and a lot of the elite level, knowledge base and partnerships and networks that were effectively established for 2 prior decades before Xi Jinping is even in the picture. In other words, for you to even be able to say that I'm going to start a China, Central Asia, West Asia economic corridor, right? You would have already been building on something that existed before that. And if you look at the major land bridges and the major land ports situated in Xinjiang and across the border in Kazakhstan, most of these predate the Belt and Road. And in fact, a lot of the major projects of the Belt and Road Initiative predate the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative. So what's fundamentally new about the Belt and Road is really the scale and scope, right? The policy rationale behind it, not fundamentally new. So what are then the primary drivers? I think Niva pointed out something very important. The first one is really security. The fact is that most of China's frontiers, Xinjiang being a core component of that, have been poorly integrated from the CCP's perspective, poorly integrated to the rest of China, culturally, politically, economically, and quite expensive to maintain historically. Xinjiang has never been profitable to any Chinese polity that has tried to control it. That hasn't changed today either, right? And so one of the things that you immediately notice is that, the CCP's effort to gain greater control and more effectively integrate these frontier regions to the core of what it sees as China, right, is motivated by security logic. They don't think that these areas are properly integrated. They think that these areas are breeding grounds for instability and problems, the Uyghur population, of course, in the crosshairs of the CCP as a result of that. And so simultaneously, you see both an effort to forcibly integrate these areas into the center of China while simultaneously opening them up, right, to immediate neighbors. Why integrate them to immediate neighbors? And that's the economic rationale for it, right? Because the CCP inherently has an underlying thread of thinking in which security and economic development are inherently linked. You can't have one without the other, right? So if you want to have economic development, you need to have political stability, and you only get political stability if you have economic development. It sounds like circular logic, but both of these things are simultaneously true within the CCP's construct of how it thinks about these problems. Now, what would be unsurprising for everybody here is, of course, that the CCP sees itself as the net provider of both of those things, meaning the CCP provides the political stability and therefore provides the environment for that economic activity to take place, right? So because it sees security as tied to economic development, right, the CCP sees that it has a fundamental problem. One, that there's a significant development gap between coastal China and the interior of China, right? And that gap is only widening. And so since the 1990s onwards, one of the biggest policy efforts by the CCP has been, how do we bridge that development gap, which we have been, woefully unable to bridge. The initial efforts were, well, we'll just build a lot of infrastructure, which, by the way, has two very key effects. One, building infrastructure brings economic development to a region, but infrastructure also has another useful purpose, which is it facilitates the ability of the state to penetrate lower levels of society. Right? You build a highway that allows you to deploy to the area quicker. You build an airport, you build a railway, it does the same. Right? In other words, state capacity is not some politically neutral thing. State capacity can be used, positive or negative outcomes. Okay? The problem with this approach is that almost all investment was centrally directed, because you have no foreign direct investment coming into the center and interior of China, definitely not to the provinces, right? If you really think about it, if I'm IBM, why on earth would I invest in Xinjiang or Qinghai or Sichuan when I can just go to Shenzhen, right? The human capital is already there, the logistics space is already there, right? All the shipping companies are based out of there. By the way, it's not that expensive to put things in a container ship and send it out to your future markets. There's no sense in me trying to invest in the center of China. The only net benefit would probably be lower labor costs, but then all of the savings in labor costs would go right through the roof when you consider that you now need to move that product into the coasts to then put it on a ship, right? So you're actually losing money. And so one of the things that the BRI tries to do to address this problem is, one, try to establish new supply chains, so hence the significant investment in logistics, not just within China, but also in Central Asia and beyond. Two, as a byproduct of these new supply chains, gain market access, right? And so the idea is that if you establish a long-term relationship with another country, and yes, corruption is part and parcel of this process too, but then again, the bizarre thing about the way the Chinese invest abroad, and I mean this as a catch-all, is that it usually takes the form of whatever legal parameters exist locally. In other words, if the host country has a very permissive environment for corruption, Chinese corporations are going to play ball, and they're probably going to be really good at it. If the local environment makes it more restrictive and in fact punitive for you to play that game, they're probably just not going to do that at all, right? Which changes the nature of how the Chinese invest depending on where they're at. So there's a security rationale, which is to more effectively integrate the rest of the interior of China into the core of China. Two, bridge an economic development gap, which they see as a security problem. And the way that they think that they can solve this problem is by new supply chains that are hopefully sustainable. And second, that this would also gain them new market access. The last domestic rationale is energy security. This is one of the reasons why Central Asia becomes so crucial to China beyond the Uyghur question in the 1990s and even to today, is energy. Right? China becomes a net energy importer. It has very natural partner, right across the border that has natural resources, and therefore it makes sense for them to become very, very interested and therefore invested in the hydrocarbon sector. But it goes beyond that, right? If you look at core Chinese investment sectors, it goes into mineral extraction, mineral processing, and all these other components, because these are things that are going to be consumed by the Chinese economy more broadly. So then what on earth do I mean then that, the BRI is centrally and locally fragmented? What I mean by that is that, like much of Chinese policy, right, the guy at the top gets to come up with a slogan, the guy at the top being Xi Jinping right now. How it actually gets implemented varies significantly, meaning Xi Jinping has an idea for the Belt and Road, or at least he thinks he has a coherent idea for the Belt and Road. And from there, every ministry wants to then stake its own role within that broader policy so that it can get access to resources, so that it can have political capital, right? But also, because the provinces themselves led the process for what become the corridors in the Belt and Road. It is these provinces that still very much dominate competition between each other over what actually gets implemented abroad. So what you'll find if you start doing field work in a lot of the countries where the Belt and Road Initiative is actually taking place, is that you're finding state-owned enterprises, but also private corporations that are led primarily by provincial level units, competing against each other over who's going to get the contracts. If you start doing questions, who are the major competitors for Chinese corporations above is themselves, because they're basically running over each other over who's going to get the deal. Right? And this actually has a lot of implications for how this looks like on the output, meaning every corridor in the Belt and Road looks very different, and every country inside those corridors will vary, not necessarily significantly, but there'll be variations even within Central Asia, which is a lot more cohesive as a regional unit. And I don't mean that like literally, but within the Belt and Road construct, more cohesive in the way that China approaches the Belt and Road in Central Asia versus, let's say, even peninsular Southeast Asia, right? The variation between countries in peninsular Southeast Asia certainly varies a lot more than it does in Central Asia, for example. And that is because, again, you have competition between ministries over who gets to green light what and how they approach certain projects. You have competition between provinces who want to situate themselves as the pivotal players in the Belt and Road, because that means that they get the majority of the resources, and that those leaders in those provinces are then better situated for promotion, right? I will close my comments, related to the Black Sea region. The middle corridor, however we want to define it, has always been important in the Chinese thinking about Eurasian connectivity, and it predates the Belt and Road by a significant margin. The difference for why the Chinese in particular have relegated the Black Sea region until recently more to the periphery is because it's a lot more politically complicated, because there's a lot more political diversity and fragmentation if you start crossing the Caspian. In other words, it's a lot easier for them to think of China-Pakistan economic corridor, or even the China, Indo-China Peninsula economic corridor, than it is for them to really put the China-Central Asia, West Asia economic corridor, in which the middle corridor is a component of it, right? It becomes more relevant now, right? Because the Chinese from the very beginning wanted diversification from Russia, and the current conflict in Ukraine gives them a really good rationale for why they should pursue alternatives. So without a doubt, and I think my co-panelists are right, Georgia's probably going to be generating a lot more attention. The Black Sea region is probably going to be generating a lot of attention. That attention could be positive, but it certainly comes with significant costs, as you were outlining earlier. I think and my final comment, the important thing to take away, in my view, study after study that's done in Belt and Road participant countries shows that those countries have quite a lot of agency to shape the way that China does business and how China operates in that particular space. Meaning, in the best French I could possibly put it, if a country has its shit together, they're probably going to be able to get quite a bit of what they want out of China while mitigating some of the potential downfalls of dealing with China. If you do not, you're probably going to be heading in a very different direction than you hope for.
Okay, thank you very much to all the panelists for these wonderful talks. I myself had several questions, but I would like to just pick one from them, and then I will hand the floor to the audience. So our panel was very China-focused, China-centered. And let me ask you on this issue from the Georgian perspective and from the perspective of the wider Black Sea region. We all agree, I believe, that the democracy is kind of a very important aspect of our resilience, let's say so. And we know that, and it was mentioned during previous panels, how Russia sees the democracy as a threat to its national interests or regime interests, and somehow tries to resist democracy promotion, for example, new democracy promotion or the Western democracy promotion in the region. What is China's take on that? I mean, that what is China's position of the democracy as such, and can China, or is China actually doing, or how China can hinder democratization in the wider Black Sea region? Or is actually China doing anything in that regard? Anyone who can take that question? I mean, Niva.
Sorry, let me jump in because China doesn't really reject democracy, but it creates new definitions of democracy. So they call it a comprehensive, consultative people's democracy. So basically, we have all consented for Xi Jinping to be the all supreme leader, and it's still a democracy, even though he. So it's a bit like North Korea that claims itself to be a democracy also, right? So they don't reject it, but of course, like, when we look at Central Asia, we look at the Chinese propaganda that's been pushing, then of course they say that Western liberal democracies are chaotic and it's destructive to, societal peace, whereas the Chinese version of democracy is more stable, it's, brings economic growth and, all that. So, Tina, maybe here.
Yeah, well, I cannot agree more. The only thing about that is that if we talk about particular pillars of the problems that are our, as you put in your question, that might hinder this democratic development in our countries, that will be that. My number one problem will be corruption that comes with lots of Chinese so-called investments or Chinese companies coming to these parts of the world. Usually I bring here example from when the very first big investor came to Georgia called British Petroleum, and when the first Chinese big investor, well, not even investor, the first Chinese company arrived in Georgia who won the state contract. And if you, there's no time for bringing that example and telling this whole story, but if you compare those to the business ethics those companies have been brought to Georgia, the understanding of the rule of law, understanding of the exceptions from the rules they brought to Georgia, it shows very well the magnitude of the problem that we are looking at. So for me, in addition to what Niva said, to this redefining sort of democracy will be corruption is one major big problem that we are facing with increased number of the Chinese companies arriving to our country.
Yeah, well, corruption, I agree. It's, when we are speaking about the resilience, I think that it's absolutely necessary. The democracy is absolutely necessary component for Georgia, but also when other countries are considering this Trans-Caspian, Trans-Caucasian corridor as an alternative to all those roads that going through either Russia or China control, they also see the democracy and security and absence, or if not absence, but the low level of corruption as a guarantee for them that it can play its own as an alternative. It can be alternative to all other roads. And in this regard, it's an absolutely necessary component for the success of this corridor.
Yeah, I think that in agreement with Niva here, I don't think the Chinese really care about regime type so long as they could do business and so long as there's some sort of partnership that they think is going to be beneficial. I do share the same concern related to corruption, although I think I find myself more in agreement with, this political economist Yang Ang's argument that corruption matters, but the type of corruption matters more, right? There's doing business in China involves quite a bit of corruption. Corruption is built into the political economy of China, and they experience astronomical growth, which has its own downsides, right? And they're obviously seeing some of those downsides now. So I think the type of corruption that they ultimately promote in any given environment certainly has an effect. But the type of corruption probably gives you a better indicator over, just how detrimental it is versus can you get something out of it.
Thank you. So now it's time to move to the audience, and maybe we can collect like 3-4 questions as far as, Dato. Then
Dato.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much. It was interesting panel, and I have two questions. First, maybe more for Niva and Tinatin. Niva very clearly described the Chinese vision of Central Asia place in the world, and Chinese future perspective being the strong connection with China, or at least a sphere of legitimacy Chinese interest. What vision China has about Europe, Western Europe, and Europe in general? And also, Tinatin, if you can answer this question, I would be very grateful too. And my second question is to all panelists. China, as we all see comparing to Russia, is more willingly or using mainly just soft power tools as its influence. Even economic influence is kind of not so military or coercive power. We all observe the radicalization or that China is preparing or is preparing itself for being ready to use coercive power. Do you think how close China is to this point when they will be ready to use its military forces in the world, in different countries?
Okay, let's take some more questions.
Thank you for interesting panel. It's Dato Kuteli. So my question is regarding the financial dimension of the strategic connectivity. While we are speaking what is our interest or what should be Western strategy in terms of connecting key geopolitical fulcrums, authoritarians do the same. They have their own understanding of strategic connectivity. Russia particularly, especially being under the sanctions. So just a few days ago there was a news that there will be a ferry connection connecting Georgia to Romania, which in general is a good news because it was long time discussed and it's important to have, and it's an east-west movement. But interestingly enough, if you dig a little bit below the surface, most of the stakeholders that are behind this operation are either Russian citizens, some Russia-connected offshores, or dual Russian-Georgian citizens. I can assume what is the rationale behind it. Russia understands that they will be sanctioned for in the foreseeable future, so they want to have some kind of bypassing logistical strategic connectivity of their own. European Union, United States, they have their own system of national security screening of the foreign direct investment. But regarding Georgia or the other countries along the way, of course, do not have this type of system. So what needs to be done to avoid authoritarians being at least one step ahead of us, and then we paying price, them owning this infrastructure, which might be vital for our understanding of strategic connectivity.
Any more questions?
We're going by the order that we have already established. So I'll be really quick. So Western Europe is not an area cover, but I work a lot with my colleague Mariah Goldberg at the German Marshall Fund in Berlin, and I would give an answer that she would typically give, which is China's pursuit in Western Europe are mainly two things. One is building business dependence, like European business dependence on the Chinese market, and so that's a prime case of that would be Volkswagen in Germany, and that has a lot of implications on German policy on China, to a point where you cannot sanction certain aspects, and Germany will actually oppose certain builds on China, right? And the second is technology acquisition, and that's a little bit different, I think, from what China looks for in other parts of the world. So I say technology acquisition, but a lot of it is stealing, right? And that's through industrial cooperation and also academic cooperation that is innocent on the surface, but there's been a lot of research that shows that a lot of the core technologies behind some of these military types of academic collaboration actually aids advances of the PRA in various aspects. And about PLC military in the world, I think so. One of the first, my latest project right now is actually looking at security activities of Chinese non-state entities because so Chinese state military organizations and entities, are quite well documented in what they're doing overseas, but the non-state entities are actually the ones that are less covered. So commercial Chinese companies are actually doing exercises and trainings with local law enforcement that's not really regulated by existing frameworks of government to government defense treaties. Chinese private security companies is also another understudied topic. So hopefully in 6 months I'll have more answer to that. And the last comment on so Russia having this whole idea to build connectivity to bypass the sanctions. I have to say China already 10 years ago has this whole grand strategy on avoiding sanctions. So what they've started doing already 10 years ago is having Chinese companies everywhere around the world. So when it comes to sanctioning on China, the company doesn't have to be China based. It's a Chinese-owned company in South Africa. What can you do? So when it comes to sanctioning China over Taiwan or whatever it has become so complicated, not just because of a manufacturing capacity. Even if you decouple or you pull out your manufacturing capacity in China, it doesn't matter. Because Chinese companies have operations around the world. Right? What can you do with that? I think that's the problem because China thinks really a lot of steps ahead because the Taiwan scenario has been something that's on the table for years, and they've been planning how best to execute, in the best environment, and they've been, cultivating that for years.
When we talk about Chinese coercive power, I think that what is important also is how we define coercive power. What do we mean by that? Because is China already coercive power for Tajikistan, where it even took the land, part of the land, in exchange for the debts that Tajikistan could not pay? How far your definition? I think the answer to your question depends on how far you go with your definition. Are we talking just about rolling the tanks over the border? Yeah, I don't expect China very soon rolling tanks over whatever borders it shares with whatever countries. But if we talk about a wider definition of the coercion, then it's all there. It's all there in Taiwan, in the streets of Taipei, when you walk, when you talk to the people. That's what everybody talks about, what kind of soft power, and not necessarily soft power, the influence they are experiencing on a daily basis. Academia will be a great example to have. For example, in this country, if we continue on the speed as we have right now, in 10 years we will have more China-educated students than Western Europe or the United States educated students. And that's the generation that is going to rule this country in 10, 15 years. And we will have fully Chinese Communist Party, United Front ideology, dominated leadership in Georgia. And unfortunately, it's not limited to Georgia. Obviously, we know that with Confucius Institutes and all other arms they have in different countries, it's the case for basically the entire world. And that was probably one of the things of part of the big vision of Europe by China as well. Confucius Institutes were part of that vision, spreading them all over Europe, in Western capitals, basically in every university. Whatever we read today about the largest, most independent, as we knew, and professional and top-notch universities in the UK, in Germany, or any other country for that matter in Western Europe. I think that's part of their coercive power. What kind of? I was just before coming here in the car. I was listening to Ambassador Nikki Haley's speech she gave a couple of weeks ago in the launch of her presidential campaign about China, And she had this very, well, the whole speech is very impressive. I would suggest you to listen to it. The other thing is whether you believe or not what she says, but the speech itself is very good. And one sentence she said about this particular issue was very, very interesting. She said, American universities need to decide whether they take American money or Chinese money. And I think that's where we are at this moment. So whatever field you touch, somehow you discover that China is already deeply involved in there. So to me, that's the coercive power China has today. Together, coupled with the things that they do in Africa or they do in other countries, we see the countries so much dependent on China already that there is no political move they can ever make without Beijing's consent.
Batu's question that for the national security screening for foreign direct investments, I think it's absolutely essential component for development of it's absolutely essential component for developing Georgia's ability to play an important role as a key country in the strategic connectivity. Because investments and money are yet another power, yet another component of the hybrid war that Russia is fighting there. And we saw in many instances, we saw that China and Russia are cooperating very closely in the areas where one of these countries has bigger interest than another. And then while it's just rings the bell when you hear that it could be the Russian investment, sometimes we can see, as Batu said, that we can see that the Chinese company comes with the investment that could be linked with Russia. So I think that it's absolutely necessary, absolutely essential component. As of soft power, I would not be that much worried about the Chinese soft power in Georgia. However, I think it should be taken seriously. And when Tina was speaking about the government-controlled television promoting Chinese solutions to the public policies and so on, it reminded me a few years I was listening Farid Zakaria speaking with the same fascination about the Chinese solutions of public policy issues. So, and I think that it's serious. Because sometimes soft power is considered as not that brutal. However, when we look at the history, soft power can be very brutal too.
So related to the question on Chinese coercion, and I actually think towards the end you're getting more to the military component. I would agree that coercion involves a lot more than the use of military force. And if we take the military force out of the equation, the Chinese have figured out how to use both diplomatic and economic coercion relatively effectively, I would argue. Economically even more sophisticated because you don't actually need to impose formal sanctions on another country in order to, twist the screw, so to speak. But to answer your question on the military more directly, outside of Taiwan, PLA's own journals and even the Academy of Military Sciences own publications, and that's the authoritative outlet for Chinese, strategic, operational, and tactical, formulation and thinking, haven't really put a lot of thought into how the PLA or what the PLA's role would be outside of China and these core interests, and if interests have grown, then how to actually project that power abroad. In other words, they find themselves in an interesting situation where China now has economic interests in almost every part of the world. They understand that may require security, a greater focus on security and particularly a role for the PLA to secure those interests abroad. But there's no consensus in the debate on how should the PLA be used to in order to secure those interests, or if the PLA should be used at all, and in the sense that there might be better tools to deploy for this purpose. I know Niva was talking about, like, you know, non-state actors here, but increasingly you find that it is really the Ministry of Public Security and, you know, Ministry of State Security that does a lot more of the outreach and coordination with similar entities abroad, so like counterterrorism, public security, these kinds of agencies around the world are the ones that China tends to pair up with the MSS and MPS to fulfill these functions, where the PLA doesn't necessarily play a role in this at all, really.
Sorry, I just have one thing, you know, because we were talking about coalition, and I just really wanted to add, because just before I came to Tbilisi, I was in Seoul, Korea for field work for almost a month. And, you know, one of the most famous example of Chinese economic coercion is actually against South Korea, where they shut down one of the biggest company that operates in China from Korea, which is the Lotte Group, because the company basically they signed an agreement to give a plot of land to the Korean government to install an anti-missile system, which China perceives as, you know, threatening to China. So anyways, the company lost immediately $1 billion in assets. And profits in China. They have completely pulled out as of last year. And so when I was in Seoul, actually, every single Korean, the average Korean, would actually have really aggressive feelings against China because of what China did. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, China is very good at using economic coercion, but the backlash against China is significant. South Korea, amongst all of the Asian countries, have the highest level of anti-Chinese sentiment. It's about 80% of the population have actually expressed that they strongly dislike the policies of the Chinese government. And I think that's very significant, because that's recent. And I think that's actually going to make the Chinese government rethink actually imposing a very strict economic coercion policies on other countries.
Okay, so we have been discussing China's coercive and soft power, and now let me exercise my powers. And with that, I would like to announce that today's part of our conference is over. So thank you very much to our panelists. And just need to remind that the conference will be continued tomorrow. We will be having two panels. The first focusing on the silencing regional states, and the second one focusing on the war in Ukraine. So thank you very much.